Not too terribly long ago, I released a behemoth of a video on Sonic Unleashed, a game which I believe had been treated unfairly for the majority of its lifespan, and which I believe deserves to be praised as the best post-adventure Sonic game. However, I'm sure you noticed, while watching the video, that I avoided talking about a certain other version of the game, one which was better received critically at the time of Unleashed's release, and which, to this day, is hotly contested as being the superior version of the World Adventure. It wasn't just the HD consoles that got some Unleashed action in 2008, with two other versions of the game releasing. The first was a mobile phone version of the game, but honestly I think I value my life and time too much to track down and play a late 2000s Nokia game, so we won't be discussing that today. The other version that came out is what we'll be discussing today, as to this day I still can't fathom exactly why people can praise this version of the game I'm going to have a go at, while lambasting our Sweet Widow HD with a clear conscience. For every Godzilla, there's a Kong, for every SA1, there's an SA2, and for every Sonic Unleashed HD, there's a Sonic Unleashed SD. While I was advocating last time that we stopped bullying Sonic Unleashed HD, I think it's high time that we all came together and siphoned our new collective love for Unleashed HD into a conscious and consistent effort to bully Sonic Unleashed for the PlayStation 2 and Wii. Before I get into exactly why I think this game deserves to endure the same treatment that the HD version unjustly has for years, let's get a little bit of perspective on the game and its developer. DIMPS are a Japanese game company you've no doubt heard of through some of their older works on the likes of the Digimon Battle Spirit games, Dragon Ball Budokai 2 and Dragon Ball Shin Budokai, or through their exploits with the Blue Blur himself. DIMPS was mainly behind the handheld portion of the franchise from the mid-2000s onwards, with hits like the Sonic Rush games, Advanced Trilogy and Sonic Colors DS, as well as their blunders with the likes of Sonic Generations 3DS and... Sonic 4 Episodes 1 and 2. Nowadays, their efforts are mainly focused on producing handheld games based on various anime, like Sword Art Online, Dragon Ball Heroes, and My Hero Academia. But the portfolio which they accrued working on the Sonic franchise is about as mixed in terms of quality as Sonic Teams is. And that's really quite depressing when I say it out loud. Despite being entrusted with only the handheld games prior to this point, in 2008, DIMPS were given the go-ahead to try their hands at designing a prior generation companion to Sonic Team's efforts on Unleashed HD. In theory, this wasn't a bad idea. DIMPS had been responsible for the Sonic titles throughout the early 2000s which had been given the most praise, as while gamers everywhere were pointing and laughing at Shadow, 06 and Secret Rings, DIMPS were knocking out hit after hit with the Advanced Trilogy and Rush Duology, the latter of which is where the idea of the boost gameplay was first introduced. Because of all this, it made total sense for them to try their hand at creating a 3D title, which used in part what is essentially the formula they themselves pioneered. The build-up to the release of Unleashed Wii was very different to the HD version's reveal cycle I discussed last time, and while writing this video I realised something. I couldn't remember seeing a trailer for the Wii version of Unleashed, despite it being the version of the game that I played first. At the time, all the advertising was focused on Sonic Team's version of the game, given that it was the bigger game of the two and was likely to be the most impressive graphically and in terms of performance, which is basically what people cared about most at the time. When it came down to it, the SD version just sorta held onto the coattails of the HD version, and when looking up trailers for it I was only able to find three: a launch trailer, a Spagonia focused trailer, and an Adabat focused trailer. At a glance, the gameplay looks fine. Not as visually impressive as the HD version, but it certainly seems to carry the same spirit for both styles of gameplay. Essentially, all the focus in terms of advertising was placed on showing off the HD version of the game, to show how impressive that version was shaping up to be, while the SD version stewed quietly in the background. Release day rolled around, and while, as previously established, the HD version was met with a collective "Ah!", the reaction to the PS2 and Wii version was more akin to with most outlets touting the game to be the superior way to experience Unleashed, ranking it from slightly to marginally higher than its HD counterpart. This is the bit that confuses me. Even as a Wii Ben, I always thought there was a massive difference between the two iterations of the game. One was an exhilarating joyride which takes full advantage of the next-gen hardware of the time to create beautiful visuals and an amazing atmosphere, and the other runs on a PS2 and Wii. Essentially, similar to how the previous video was all about highlighting the positive aspects of Unleashed HD, which I feel are overlooked, and rationalising the criticisms it faced, this video will be a discussion of the differences between the two versions, and will detail exactly why I think the SD version is so much of a downgrade in comparison. This, obviously, will pretty much be exclusively focusing on gameplay and presentation differences between the two versions, given how the soundtrack and story are identical across the two. So let's examine just how the Dimpsy DNA of the SD version of Unleashed makes it not quite as cool or handsome as its Sonic Team twin brother. The differences between the two versions are apparent as early as the title screen. For the HD version we had something quite simple but incredibly effective. The game's logo on full display, the Shattered Earth in the background and the World Adventure blaring. Without saying or doing much of anything, it immediately gives you a feel for what the adventure is all about and, as I said, is effective in just how simple of an idea it is. In the SD version, before we even get to the title screen, the game plays that spectacular opening cutscene from the HD version. It's a little more compressed here, but it's still so gorgeous. Actually, this version of the game tries to show you this cutscene every time you start the game up, so if you feel like treating yourself to a viewing every now and then, here you are. From here, we find ourselves at the title screen of the game, and instead of this quaint and impactful one we saw in the HD version, we have a GIF made of assets from the box art. Okay, this isn't an outright terrible title screen, just not as effective as the HD version in my eyes. I like the fact that it starts off with the laser that Eggman shoots actually hitting the planet and splitting it apart, and I like how everything appearing on the title screen is synced up with the world adventure. It does look a little gaudy though with how they split the render of Sonic from the box art in half, complete with a fade to separate both halves of the render, as there's actually no full versions of either halves of Sonic from UnWiished's box art. Basically, this isn't bad or anything, I just prefer the HD version's take on it. The more egregious differences present themselves though in our first instance of gameplay. After watching the introductory cutscenes, we're asked to complete a series of tutorials for daytime Sonic. These cover his entire arsenal, showing you how to use all of his new moves like boosting, drifting, sliding, running and jumping. Right, on the one hand, these tutorials are incredibly thorough and very friendly for new players. On the other hand, these are also incredibly mundane, going over the most basic aspects of Sonic's kit in individual tutorials. Like, I don't need an entire stage dedicated to telling me how to press the jump button or move the analog stick. Some of these even have Chip halt gameplay entirely and explain in painstaking detail in up to 3 separate text boxes how each of the moves work, extending the already excessive tutorial even more. I get UnWiished has some new moves which you'll need to be familiarised with in order to play the game efficiently, but the HD version handles this by giving you control of Sonic for a shorter scale level, teaching you the basics like platforming, homing attacking, boosting and quick-stepping without being overly patronising, and while the hint bubbles in that version do also halt gameplay temporarily should you use them, they aren't voiced and don't begin with an animation of Chip flying in.
You can press the X button to jump.
Which is admittedly a nice little touch, but you can never ever skip it, and as a result it loses its charm given the amount of tutorials you need to sit through. That version also gives you button prompts on screen to tell you exactly what to do to perform the action and help you bypass the different sections of that tutorial stage, meaning that the hint bubbles likely won't even be necessary given how effective these visual prompts are in that version. Giving the player this type of smaller level to get them used to the game before asking them to complete a full actual level is quite an effective way to teach people how to play the game, as it allows the players to apply the skills they'll need in a safe but realistic context, which the Wii version doesn't do until you've sat down through 6 tutorials in a row, only after which it asks you to play a tutorial stage similar to the one in UnWiished HD. This stage, however, is literally comprised of the different sections of the tutorials you just had to sit through, all mashed together with a little bit of extra fluff added in. This approach to teaching players how the game works is over the top but thorough at best, and a mundane and dull way to kick things off at worst. It's here where we get a look at how the design of the day stages differ greatly from their HD counterparts. In the HD version, levels are more compactly designed to help players control themselves better while they're boosting, with alternate paths being integrated to handle secrets and collectibles more often than not. UnWiished SD, however, has a much broader design, opening the levels up a bit and giving players more space to explore within the levels. This seems like a good idea, until you realise that, comparatively speaking, the SD version has a lot more booster pads and springs, which means the control is being taken away from the player more often than in the HD version. As such, these levels being more open in their design begins to make them feel a lot more empty than those in the HD version, as often you just find yourself watching Sonic sprint in a straight line after hitting a boost pad or bounding from spring to spring, with the only real input you can contribute being hitting the boost button occasionally to gain a burst of speed. This is also true for the alternative routes you can take throughout the levels. Whereas they were used in the HD version to guide you to collectibles or major shortcuts, here they're exclusively used for that shortcut aspect, for reasons I'll discuss a little more in depth later. While the reward for taking these alternate routes is more often than not just a faster way to the goal, these routes usually just cut off a single corner of the level and aren't as major as the shortcuts and alternate paths in the HD version, usually ending with a rainbow ring or series of springs where you just watch Sonic go. This wouldn't feel so bad if it wasn't for the fact that a lot of the time it doesn't really feel like you earn taking that shortcut. In the likes of Empire City, Holoska, heck, Pretty much any level in the HD version, you feel like you weren't taking a shortcut through your actions, making a hard jump, taking a leap of faith, precisely maneuvering Sonic. Here it's just, I walked onto a boost pad, I did a homing attack chain. One feels like you earned taking the alternate path, and the other just feels very matter of fact. There's less challenge to taking the routes in the SD version, and resultantly there's less reward and a diminished feeling of gratification when you do take them. The only real challenge involved in these alternate paths is actually getting Sonic to move towards them, as a lot of the time he feels rather stiff when he's at top speed, and the boost doesn't help this at all, as it functions slightly different to the HD version. While rings still fuel your boost, instead of it being a continuous improvement to your speed while being used and allowing you to barrel through enemies uninterrupted, in the SD version the boost gauge is actually segmented, with more and more segments being added to it the more rings you collect. When you press the boost button here, you gain an initial burst of speed and can blast through foes for a few seconds before you stop boosting and need to reactivate the power. There's actually an interesting aspect of timing to this, making it so you have to time using your boost gauge to gain maximum speed and usage out of the ability, but it also feels a lot clunkier than the HD version of the game as a trade-off, with it pretty much forcing Sonic to commit to sprinting in a straight line with very little wiggle room. This clunkiness is further exasperated by when you actually collide with robots or enemies, as, in what feels like an attempt to emphasize the impact of smashing into an enemy at high speeds, Sonic will momentarily stutter before he plows through the enemy. I understand what they're going for here, but it just makes the already disjointed boost feel that little bit more odd. This even extends into the homing attack a little bit. As opposed to just being able to homing attack straight to the next enemy like in the HD version, or pretty much any other Sonic game outside of 06 and Secret Rings, when you hit an enemy here, you need to wait till Sonic reaches the apex of his bounce before executing the next attack. This isn't too different to the HD version, but there the boost from the homing attack feels a lot quicker, so it keeps the pace of the game up even in that small way. Here though, Sonic's ascent and the attack itself feel a lot slower, so it again, all feels that little bit clunky. This all ties back into a feature of the game which is exclusive to this version. The action gauge. As you perform things like homing attack chains, bouncing off springs, hitting boost pads, light speed dashing, etc., you'll begin to build up a combo. Once this combo is dropped, you're rewarded with extra boost, which scales with how high of a combo you manage to achieve. This is actually a pretty neat idea, rewarding you for keeping a flow within the daytime stages. Looking at it more cynically though, as long-time Sonic fans / losers like me tend to do, this is a way to try and mask how little you're actually doing in these stages, distracting you with a number that goes up and takes up a good chunk of the screen from the fact that most stages consist mainly of springs, boosters, and things that only require one button to do, like homing attack chains or light speed dashing. And when you're not doing these things, you're just running in a straight line more often than not, maybe drifting if you're lucky, which also rewards you with more boost in this version. While similar arguments could be made for the HD version, the diverse level segments, camera angles, and gimmicks that each of those stages bring, as well as their visually more compact design, make this less of an issue, or at the very least seem less glaring. I think there's no more clear example of this than Spagonia's clock tower set piece. In the HD version, it's a case of you having to do a small homing attack chain, the odd quick time event, and you're rewarded with this beautiful visual. Nothing that's going to set the world on fire in terms of gameplay, but it's something, right? What do you do in this version of the game to get that set piece? You homing attack a pulley, and it just takes you right at the top. There's no challenge, no matter how dated or small those in the HD version may be, no build up by climbing the clock tower, no excitement in hopping from one spike to another, just up he goes. I don't think I need to say anything more, this just speaks for itself. These issues I've got with the gameplay and level design aren't helped by the progression system in this game, as after completing a day stage, in order to access items which allow you to progress to the next area, you'll need to complete various missions within the day stage you've just played. This is in a very similar vein to everyone's favourite Sonic game, Sonic and the Secret Rings, which also had you completing mundane challenges within levels cut up into segments in order to progress. Here it's nowhere near as abstract or directionless as in Secret Rings, as one mission just unlocks to the next after you've beaten them in order, but replaying the same level segments over and over and over to do stuff like grab X amount of rings, don't smash any pots, and all your other favourites. Just makes the flaws with the levels all the more obvious, as it isolates specific segments of the levels and has you play them over and over again for what feels like the sake of it, giving you more time to notice just how bare these stages feel when you're not focusing on blasting through them. I don't get why they went with this method of progression, honestly. It was boring in Secret Rings, and while not as problematic, it's still boring here too. I think the best words to summarise Daytime Sonic's gameplay in this version would be clunky and disjointed. From his progression, to his movement, to his levels, it's all lacking a sense of cohesion, smoothness and flow which is present within the HD version of the game. Is this to say his levels here are straight up unfun? No. Some of their individual gimmicks and unique level segments like the ice caves in Holoska, the spear assault in Shunan, and the fleshed out desert areas of Shamar are neat, but when examined side by side with the other version of the game, they're nowhere near as enjoyable or involving. I think it speaks volumes that in your high-speed platformer, running and jumping feel clunky, and this isn't helped by the level design, which most of the time seeks to take control away from the player in favour of exemplifying speed in an entirely controlled way. Honestly, the daytime gameplay here feels more like a restrictive Sonic Colors or a more involved Sonic Forces than an alternative version of Sonic Unleashed. Let's focus now on my mate, the Werehog, because haha, I hate him in this game. Starting off, he runs straight into the exact same tutorial issues as daytime Sonic does, and whereas here the Werehog could have had all his combat basics in one tutorial, they once again opt to give you 5 separate tutorials to cover everything individually and in painstaking detail. The way the Werehog controls here is also completely different to the HD version, as, you see friends, this version was built with the Wii in mind, and that means working around the fact that the Wii mode has less buttons than your average controller. The intention is to have one of the Werehog's fists mapped to the Wiimote and the other mapped to the nunchuck for combat. In the PS2 version, this translates to the fact that each fist is assigned to a different button, square for the left and circle for the right, with triangle being used for special attacks like launchers and combo finishes. This is a weird configuration, but I wouldn't say outright awful. It means you can end combos whenever you want with the dedicated finisher button, but the combo list here is way shorter in this version, meaning that all these cool and flashy finishes lose their luster far faster than the HD version because you're limited to how many of them there actually are here. The place where things start to feel less comfortable though is in the actual movement of the Werehog, and this is especially prevalent when activating the Werehog's sprint. Since without sprinting, the Werehog moves like a gamer whose mum's called him for his tea, and here has more empty sections in his levels where you're just plodding along waiting for the next enemy encounter, you'll want to have this portly punchman sprinting to ensure the levels aren't taking an age. More on that one later. How you activate his sprint here though feels super unintuitive. You tap the analog stick twice, meaning that you never feel super certain if you've actually activated the sprint or not, as Sonic sort of jolts forward then breaks into his sprint as opposed to immediately sprinting like in the HD version. This not only makes it less easy to start sprinting, but once you're off and away you have to come to a complete halt to stop him from sprinting, which makes it feel much more natural than just having to let go of the button, and gives his movement a very stop-start feel. The Werehog also feels like he's running on ice whenever he's sprinting, meaning he's far more slippery than the other version of the game, and everything I've mentioned makes the sprint much less of a comfortable time in this version, meaning you have the choice of flinging yourself about and taking off whenever you jump, or plodding through levels looking like a right pudding. The control problems with the Werehog don't stop there, and begin to seep into his platforming too. While he certainly wasn't the most mobile in the air in HD, he at least felt satisfying to control, and the double jump felt natural. Here though, this isn't exactly the case, as Sonic's double jump feels more like he's just sort of jolting himself up in the air and doesn't give you much more reach. Basically, it's good at popping you up, but robs you of all your forward momentum in doing so, meaning that it's to extend your height as opposed to how far you're actually jumping. I think what they're going for here is they want you to use the sprint to cover distance and the double jump to sort of just make some more height, but I don't know man, the double jump here just feels way less useful than in HD Unleashed. Another thing which I didn't actually have written down on this script initially and only got a proper feel for when replaying the game to record footage is just how sluggish the Werehog feels when you try to use his arms for any platforming. In the HD version, you lock on, press circle or B or whatever, and the Werehog grabs the thing. It's fast, responsive, and it keeps the flow, and you can even press jump as soon as you pull up to the thing you're grabbing onto to spring off and do a little jump. In UnWiished though, it always feels as if there's a slight delay when doing so. I'm assuming this is to give players in the Wii version enough time to react, given the use of motion controls there, but the Werehog will always take a second or two to actually reach out for the thing you're wanting to grab, whether it's a ledge, a pole, or an enemy. What's more, you have to make sure you keep the grab button held down here, because if you don't, the Werehog just gives up on trying to grab the thing and starts falling, and because of how sluggish the grab is here, there's no time for a second attempt. This is, I'm assuming, because in the Wii version, you need to wiggle the Wiimote and nunchuck to keep the grab going. This is probably to make the most of the motion controls and to ensure the player's still involved even at that point. But in the PS2 equivalent, this translates to making what should be simple simple platforming sequences feel incredibly stilted. The control choices made to accommodate the Wii version also impact his combat as well, as the Werehog here feels much more limited. He can still grab and throw things, which he moves faster when doing so here, but in terms of physical hits he's restricted much more heavily to just swinging until you maybe have a finisher come out. Like the HD version, you do unlock more combat techniques as you go, but leveling him up works much differently here. Instead of having a level up screen at the end of every level, where you can allocate experience yourself earned as both daytime and Werehog Sonic, here experience is gained from defeating Dark Gaia minions at nighttime only. The experience, or Gaia Force, that you earn also only affects the Werehog, giving him more life, unleashed power and combat techniques. This effectively addresses an issue that I'd raised with the leveling up in HD, where there were far too many categories for the player to pick from when choosing where to place their experience. But it's also not all good news for UnWiished either, as the leveling up system is handled far differently. Instead of choosing which attribute to increase with your experience, every point you get is put into this wheel, which at various increments will upgrade one of the facets of the Werehog I just mentioned, meaning that you might get that strength upgrade you're after, or you might just end up with more unleashed energy. This is the complete opposite extreme to the HD version. While there you chose where to invest your experience, meaning you get something you want and which is of immediate use, but there's also a lot more areas to invest into, so it makes it harder to get a balance of everything. Here there are fewer areas to focus on, meaning it's easier to have a good amount of life, strength, unleashed and combos by the end of the game, but the choice being taken away from you means that you might get something useful, or you might get something you don't need or want at that time. A compromise between these two would have made for a super effective leveling up system, but as they both stand, I feel I like the HD versions take better, as it ensures you're getting something you want and can use immediately as opposed to what at times feels like potluck. The fact that your bevy of combat techniques is also tied to this leveling up system makes the combat here feel far more repetitive than the HD version right from the offset, and this issue isn't helped by the fact that there's far more of the combat and the Werehog himself in this version. What I mean is that the Werehog here has more levels overall in the game. For every one proper daytime level, not counting missions of course, there's at least 3 Werehog levels, and this number only goes up as the game progresses, as some of the levels the Werehog has will focus more on platforming set pieces and others more on combat. And I bet you can't guess which is more common. Even the platforming levels will feature some fighting, and this version seems to mostly cut away from the explorative aspects of the HD version to allow the other 2 aspects of the Werehog to gain greater focus. Because of this though, the level design becomes incredibly linear for the most part, and it just feels like when you're not doing platforming, you're just walking along looking for somebody to kick off at. What's more, there's a notable difference in enemy variety between the 2 versions too. HD will throw a variety of foes at you from as early as the first couple night stages. Nightmares, titans, frights, bees, flowers, eels, tiny Rexes, bats, big mamas, the different types of wizard, various types of Eggman robots. All of these enemies are there in the HD version to test your skills and variety of combat techniques. Each of them have a unique strategy and appearance, and can change the dynamic of fights just by being there. In the Wii version, unfortunately though, this roster of foes is drastically reduced. You've got nightmares, frights, titans, bees, and this bomb fellow who's actually exclusive to the SD version of the game. Is that all, I hear you ask? Absolutely not. You also get these exact same enemies, but with some sunburn. This approach to enemy variety feels rather lazy, and a massive step down from what was present in the HD version of the game. This also contributes to the issues I have with the combat of the Werehog here, as not only is it too abundant and less engaging due to the lack of combos, but it's also far more repetitive because you're going to be fighting the same enemies over and over and over in different areas. Man, the Werehog's just so dull in this version. Some of the platforming stages he gets are fine, but the combat-focused ones just drag on and on and on. This, again, is exasperated by having multiple Werehog levels back to back. Okay, so as I said at the start, this begins with only having 3 levels for every 1 Sonic level. Each of these levels, when put together, could maybe equal the length of 1 Werehog level in the HD version, give or take maybe a minute or 2 each way. But whereas that 1 level in the HD version is cohesive and has you doing lots of different things so it doesn't drag on nearly as much, the multiple shorter levels all back to back mean that you get exhausted of the Werehog a lot quicker here. Oh, and 3 is just at the start of the game. By the end, you're expected to do 5 Werehog levels, one after the other, and man, it's just nowhere near as fun. Oh, and the area that has the 5-level marathon, it's Eggman Land. You know, my favourite level from HD, the thing I praised massively at the end of my video and called it the best level in the franchise. Yeah, here it goes from a fun and challenging finale to what could be considered to be the worst point of the game. It's bogged down so heavily by Werehog content, which here is far less interesting than what we saw Store and UnWiished. Labeling each of his stages as the separate parts of an infiltration of the Eggman land is quite neat, and I think the daytime section is like fine, but even my precious Eggman land isn't safe from Dimps' meddling. I'm sure you've noticed by this point, but I don't have a lot of nice things to say about the werehog in this version of the game. Every complaint that's put against him in the HD version of the game, too much combat, levels are too long, not enough platforming, are all far more applicable to this version of the game, and yet it's the HD version that gets all the flack for doing all of this. I really don't get it, honestly, but I think playing the werehog in this version makes me understand how people feel about him in the HD version, because while I may have had a go at the day stages in this version of the game, the werehog here is so much less fun than the day stages this version offers. Oh yeah, there's also the boss fights. Generally, there's not much changed here, but there are a couple of noteworthy tweaks. The daytime bosses are all pretty much identical to the HD version, just with less visual pizzazz. The same goes for the Phoenix and Dragoon. The Moray and Guardian are the ones with the larger changes. The Moray shield in this version, instead of being generated by eels, is instead made up by these battery packs which surround the outside of his arena. Basically, you just run up and smack them a few times as you would the eels and they'll go down. But these things put up literally no resistance, and the stand-in for the eels are instead the nightmares. Yeah, they'll follow you around the arena and try to hit you, the operative word there being try, because those things never catch up to you if you're just pelting around the arena breaking the battery packs. Once you end up fighting the Moray head on after you've brought down his shield as well, you can even straight up ignore his weak spots, as while they do massive damage and speed up the fight as a whole, you can actually just hit him anywhere on his body for chip damage. Because of that, the nitroglycerin gimmick is actually completely unnecessary in this version of the fight, and while it does make it easier, the fact that it's not mandatory and the absence of the eel enemies makes this fight a lot less interesting than the HD version in my opinion. The Guardian fight also drops the block pushing idea as well, and just has you wailing on him, so he's essentially no different to one of the Dark Titans you'll fight in the regular night stages. Basically, these two fights ditch their most annoying aspects, but in turn lose some of their uniqueness, as pretty much you're just doing at that point what you do to any other regular enemy in the game. The boss with the most notable changes though is the final boss, and honestly I think this is my favourite boss in the game. It retains the running sections from the HD version of the game as the middle portion of the fight. Fun fact, this is the first and only time the game has your rail switching, but takes a different approach for the beginning and ending sections of the fight. Instead of lugging the Colossus towards Dark Gaia, this time Chip instead decides to have a boxing match with Dark Gaia. This is really funny, and honestly I prefer it vastly to the HD version, because instead of controlling a slow and clunky Colossus, you're bobbing and weaving quickly around claw swipes and battering the beast when you get an opening. The final part of the fight is also rather different. Instead of being a 3D affair filled with lots of quick time events, it's instead a 2D fight where you avoid attacks while trying to gather enough rings to target one of Dark Gaia's 7 eyes, before avoiding obstacles as you go to ramp through it. The only bad thing I've got to say here is that sometimes lining up the target reticle for the eyes is a bit messy. It's actually what stopped me from beating the game for a couple days as a kid, because the last eye that I had to go through before finishing the fight just wouldn't lock on properly. Other than that though, I rather enjoyed the boss. I don't know if I'd put it above the HD version's final fight, but it certainly does have its own merits, so thumbs up. I guess another thing I can praise about this version of the game is the absence of the tornado defense sections. While they were nice being there, they just weren't fun at all, and this version just completely cuts them, so that's a positive. One thing I don't like at all, however, is how this version of the game tackles its hub worlds. Okay, so this issue's actually sort of complicated, but the way that the hub worlds of the towns at least are handled here, I dislike immensely. So, in the HD version, we've got these explorable, charming hub worlds. Each of them is distinct in design, scale, and setting, and each has a cornucopia of NPCs to chat to either accept side missions from or just flesh out the area through their unique dialogue. There's shops where you can grab souvenirs, and a completely separate action hub area which you explore to enter stages and find collectibles in. So what does this version of the game do? Removes this aspect entirely and replaces the areas you would be exploring with JPEGs of themselves. I get technological limitations and all that, but this is the workaround they came up with, gutting the hub worlds and replacing them with what is essentially the equivalent of an interactive DVD menu where you choose an area, mash through walls of dialogue until maybe the person you're talking to gives you the thing you need to progress, and if not, you rinse and repeat by clicking on different areas until you maybe find the person who gives you the thing you need. Fair enough, they probably couldn't have done something on the same scale as the HD version's hubs, and sure, they take this opportunity to flesh out certain characters by having them act as guardians of the area's temple, but it's just nowhere near as good as what the HD version gave us for these town hubs. The action hubs, however, are a different story. I mentioned that certain characters act as guardians of the temples of each area, right? Well, the Gaia temples themselves, which in the HD versions were only the settings for cutscenes, act as the action hubs for this version of the game. They're a bit basic in terms of looks. They're all just grey, bricky rooms which let you access the levels and bosses of each continent. They also don't feature any entrances to alternative acts, but there's a good reason for that. There are none. The missions for the daytime levels outright replace them in this version, and the Werehog already has enough levels and I'm not clamouring to play any more as him. What you may have noticed though is in this version of the game, I've neglected to mention the Sun and Moon medals, and that's because here, they're not mandatory collectibles, but instead rewards you earn based on the ranks which you get at the end of each level. They're used to unlock extras, concept art, movies, secret information, etc., but also let you open these extra doors in the Gaia gates once you've gathered enough. These doors reveal optional puzzle rooms for either the Werehog, Sonic, or a combination of both, and beating one of these rewards you with either one of the aforementioned extras or an extra life upon completion. This game doesn't handle extra lives though in the traditional sense. Every time you game over or start the game up, you'll start with a base amount of lives. At the beginning of the game, this is 2. But if you complete one of these extra rooms, you end up being rewarded with this extra life, which, instead of just giving you 1 extra life to use once, ups your overall total of extra lives you can hold at the start of every play session. I think this is a really great idea for not only rewarding the player for getting better at the game and unlocking more Sun and Moon doors, but it also removes the medal collecting aspect of the HD version, which, given the differences in terms of level design here, would have been much more obtuse in this version of the game had it been included. I still ultimately prefer the action hubs in the other version of the game, and there's literally no comparison to be made between the town hubs present in both versions, but the Gaia gates are a really nice idea, and a fair enough substitute for the action hubs in this version of the game. The last things I want to talk about are just tiny little details, so we'll just rattle through them. I like that when you travel from one continent to another, there's a small animation of the tornado flying there. It reminds me of Looney Tunes back in action on the PS2 as well. When rotating the Earth in this version, the rumbling noise it makes is a lot more satisfying than the HD version. I like how if you press the boost button at the right time before starting a level, you do a little spin dash, which gives you a boost immediately. I like that if Sonic is boosting and hits a wall, he just sort of bounces off it, or if you're going too fast, flats and pancakes like he's in a cartoon. These are some really nice little touches, but I also have some smaller grievances. In this version of the game, there are a few unique ranking animations, with Daytime Sonic having 3, C, B and A sharing 1, and S, and the Werehog only having 2. With C and B sharing 1 and A and S sharing the other. There's also fewer ranks overall, with the range being reduced from the traditional E to S to C to S instead. Sonic growls every time he boosts, and barks every time he drifts. When Sonic is on top of water at speed, he'll stay afloat like in the HD version, but unlike in that game where you see him visibly running atop the water, he just sort of surfs, I guess? I understand what they're going for here, but it just looks proper jank. I'm not usually a stickler for graphics in these types of games, particularly PS2 games, but while Daytime Sonic looks okay, I guess, the Werehog just looks off. I'm hesitant to say the word unfinished because I don't think it's too terrible, but he looks much worse on this version of the game, and this extends into his animations as well. Like, is this meant to be him howling? Lastly, Empire City, one of my favourite levels in the game, just isn't here. Since it's not story relevant, it's just not present here, nor is the daytime level for Missouri. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is, while I can understand to a degree why this version of the game had to have certain limitations and may have these different visual touches, I think it goes a long way to just downgrade the overall presentation of the game when compared to its HD counterpart. With all that out of the way, I think I've said about all I've got to say about the Sonic Unleashed SD. In short, it's a rougher looking and feeling companion piece to the excellence of HD'd. I feel like I may have given off the impression throughout this video that I downright dislike the game because of how I've discussed it, and I just want to end by saying that this isn't totally the case. It still has the same stellar story and soundtrack, but to me is such a massive downgrade in terms of both gameplay and presentation that it's nowhere near comparable to the other version of Unleashed. Yeah, it removes the medal collecting and hub worlds, which some found obtuse, but it also compromises gameplay and presentation, which, in my eyes, does more harm than the good those positive tweaks bring. ring. No matter how weird you find the werehog and how pointless you find the medals and hubs in HD Unleashed, it surely can't be worth sacrificing the great gameplay and design that version has. Maybe saying this game deserves to be bullied is a little harsh because, as I said, I still think the game is fine. If Unleashed HD is like an A or an 8.5, then this is a C, or like a 6, I guess. It completely baffles me though how people can consider this to be the better version of Unleashed, as most of what the HD version has been slammed for over the past decade, this game is more guilty of. If you personally enjoyed the game, then fair enough, but when you try and argue it being the superior version of Unleashed for trimming the fat of the HD version while also taking away good bits of the meat, that's when you lose me. I hope over the course of these two videos, I've been able to make a convincing argument for Unleashed being worth more than it was initially perceived to be worth over a decade ago. It still, to this day, holds up as a shining example of exactly how you do a 3D Sonic game, and a decade ago was exactly what the series needed to show the world that Sonic still had plenty of spring in his step, amidst concerns that the series was doomed to keep pushing out titles like Shadow, 06 and Secret Rings forever. Even now, almost 13 years on from when we were all first given the chance to partake in the world adventure, I still view Unleashed as the best game the series has put out since SA1. So while rumours swirl and concerns and anticipations grow for whatever Sonic will show us for his 30th birthday, I remain hopeful that the same passion, care and love that created Unleashed almost 13 years ago can be found again by Sonic Team. Regardless if that happens though, Unleashed will remain a clear example of the series at its best. The love that was put behind the game is unmistakable. It takes risks that seem unfathomable, but end up sticking the landing. The quality of the HD version is quite frankly unbelievable, and to this day, in terms of what it meant for the series and what it means to me personally, Unleashed remains unmatched.